They laughed at me. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning, because if you don't understand the laugh, you won't understand anything else that happened. 400 species, gathered inside a chamber, carved from the hollowed core of a dead moon, and when I walked through those doors, alone, carrying a satchel and a thermos, they laughed. Some of them made sounds I could not identify. Some of them communicated amusement through color changes in their skin. Some simply turned to each other in the way beings have turned to each other since the beginning of social life, sharing a joke that needed no translation. I was the joke. I pulled out a chair, sat down, opened my thermos, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The laughter got louder. I took a slow sip and looked out at the chamber, at tiers of alien delegates stacked so high above me that the upper rows vanished into shadow. I nodded politely at no one in particular. Then I opened my notebook, actual paper, actual pen, and began writing. My name is Elias Vance. At the time, I held the rank of commander in the United Nations Solar Diplomatic Corps, which was a title impressive enough on Earth and completely meaningless everywhere else. I was 39 years old. I had spent 14 years studying alien languages, alien law, and alien psychology. I had a wife back home, a daughter who had just started learning to ride a bicycle, and a planet of 8 billion people whose continued right to exist was, in some legal sense, being decided in this room. Earth sent one man to represent all of that. Just me. I had not always been comfortable with this plan. 14 years before I sat in that chamber, humanity made first contact. It was not the dramatic cinematic event our science fiction had promised us. There was no mothership over a major city. There was a signal, then a response, then a long and careful process of translation and verification that took almost 3 years before anything resembling a conversation happened. When it did, we learned something immediately humbling. We were not special. We were not the first. We were, in fact, very late to a gathering that had been going on for millennia. The Galactic Conclave had over 400 member species. Some had been traveling between stars when humans were still drawing on cave walls. We were granted something called observation status, which was exactly as meaningful as it sounds. We could attend sessions. We could not vote. We could speak only when invited to do so. We were guests at a banquet that had started without us and would continue long after us, and the polite consensus seemed to be that we should be grateful for even that much. The Keth Empire did not think we deserved even that. 700 worlds, the largest military presence in the known conclave. The Keth had been expanding their territory for 300 years, through a combination of open warfare and legal maneuvering, so sophisticated, it had its own academic field. They had identified Earth's solar system as resource-rich and politically inconvenient, and they had spent 2 years quietly building a legal case to have it reclassified as ungoverned space. That phrase was conclave law. It meant that no recognized species held sovereignty over it. It meant anyone could move in. The conclave extended humanity one courtesy. A representative could address the body before the vote was finalized. It was, as one of our analysts put it, the diplomatic equivalent of asking a man if he had any final words before the decision was already made. I was called into a small room in Geneva on a Tuesday morning in October. There were 7 people at the table. They told me what they wanted me to do. I told them it would not work. They told me it would. They were very calm about it, calmer than made sense, looking back. "We're not sending a fleet," one of them said. "We're not making a threat. We're sending you." "One person," I said. "One person who knows how to sit quietly and make other people nervous," she replied. "One person who will make them curious about what they're missing. Can you do that?" I told her I could try. That was apparently enough. I was on a transport within 48 hours. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Conclave was the largest interior space I had ever seen in my life. The walls were smooth and dark, and light came from sources I could not locate. The central table was built to accommodate dozens of species simultaneously, each section adapted for different physiologies. My section was small, human-sized. It had been added relatively recently, and it looked it. I set up my thermos, my notebook, and a small framed photograph of my daughter that I placed facing me on the table. I had been told this was unusual. I had been told it might draw attention. That was precisely why I did it. The session opened. The Keth ambassador, a being of enormous physical presence whose translator rendered his voice as something like rolling thunder, presented the legal case against Earth's sovereignty in precise and exhaustive detail. It was, technically, brilliant. I took careful notes. When the session chair asked if humanity wished to offer an initial response, I looked up from my notebook. "Not yet," I said pleasantly. "We're still listening." This produced another ripple of amusement through the chamber. I smiled back at no one in particular, recapped my pen, and wrote a few more notes. The vote was scheduled in 6 days. I had 6 days to be the most interesting person in the room, without saying anything of substance. It was, in some ways, the purest diplomatic challenge I had ever faced. I spent those first days doing almost nothing. I attended every session. I listened to testimony from species I had only read about in files. I nodded thoughtfully at arguments. I ate my meals in the communal hall and made small, genuine conversation with anyone who approached me. I asked an elder from the Venathi about her homeworld's tidal patterns. I complimented a Thres delegate on the elegance of his translation technology. I was relentlessly, cheerfully present, and I said nothing of consequence to anyone. On the third day, the Vandrel Ninth Fleet disappeared. It was 43 warships, a standard Keth forward positioning force, sent to establish a presence near Sol's outer markers before the vote concluded. Standard practice, entirely legal. They entered a region of space designated in conclave records as a human deep survey corridor, routine science territory, the kind of filing nobody reads, and they did not come out the other side. No wreckage, no distress signal, no debris of any kind, just silence. The conclave paused. Emergency sessions were called. The Keth demanded answers from everyone who might have them, and no one did. I attended every emergency session. I listened carefully. I took notes. I finished my coffee. The Thres ambassador leaned toward me during one recess and asked, quietly, whether my species had something to do with what had happened. "We sent one diplomat," I reminded her, with what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Just me." She studied me for a long moment. Then she sat back and said nothing further. But she watched me differently after that. Over the following 12 days, 3 more fleets vanished. The Keth's Forward Reconnaissance Group, a mercenary force contracted by a syndicate with financial interests in ungoverned Sol space. Then a Keth response fleet, sent specifically to find out what had happened to the others. Each one passed into the deep survey corridor. Each one simply stopped existing in any detectable way. The chamber changed around me. The laughter was gone. Something else had replaced it. Not panic exactly, but the specific discomfort of beings who have told a joke and are beginning to suspect the punchline is not what they expected. Species that had ignored me began watching me. Delegates who had not learned my name began saying it carefully in hallways. I was invited to 3 separate private dinners by ambassadors who, 2 weeks earlier, would not have acknowledged my existence. I attended all 3. I ate well, I conversed warmly, and I said nothing. The Keth Grand Admiral came to my quarters on the 11th night. This was a staggering breach of conclave etiquette. He was a decorated military leader of a civilization 7 centuries old, and he stood in my doorway with something in his bearing that I had not expected to ever see from a Keth: uncertainty. "What is your species doing?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment, then I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. "We sent 1 diplomat," I said. "You're looking at him." "The fleets. I'm not aware of any human activity in those regions," I said, which was a careful and completely accurate statement. "You're welcome to scan every centimeter of this station and every object I've brought aboard. You'll find a thermos, a notebook, a photograph, and about 4 days' worth of meal rations." He scanned my quarters. He found exactly those things. He left without another word. The vote was postponed the following morning, pending investigation. It was the first time in the recorded history of the Galactic Conclave that a vote had been suspended because a major power's fleets had ceased to function. Now I want to tell you what was actually happening, because you have been patient and you deserve to know. Humanity did not send a fleet to that region of space. That was true, in the most literal sense. What humanity sent was something that had no name in conclave law, because conclave law had never anticipated it. 14 years of engineering, conducted quietly, documented as geological and atmospheric survey equipment, built and positioned before I was ever given my assignment. Not warships. Not weapons, technically. Autonomous systems that generated layered fields of electromagnetic disruption, combined with localized gravitational interference. Technology assembled from 3 separate alien species' discarded survey data that we had spent a decade studying, combining, and improving. Ships that entered that corridor lost all propulsion, all communication, all ability to navigate. They floated, intact, in perfect darkness, with no way to leave and no way to call for help. They were not destroyed. Not a single crew member was harmed. They were held, quietly and completely, until we chose to let them go. The legal designation of Deep Survey Corridor was filed 14 years prior. It was public record. Nobody had read it, because nobody reads the bureaucratic filings of a species that has barely managed fusion drives. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. I was not the weapon. I was the proof that there was no weapon. I was the one human being in that entire system, with my thermos and my notebook, making it impossible to point at humanity and say we had done anything aggressive at all. My job was to sit in that room and be exactly what they thought I was. A lone, slightly unusual representative of a young and helpless civilization, while simultaneously being the single most important person in the conclave, because as long as I remained calm, remained polite, and remained silent, the entire legal and strategic architecture our people had built held perfectly together. The moment I reached for a threat, it collapsed. The moment I showed fear, it collapsed. The moment I said the wrong word to the wrong delegate, we lost everything. So I drank my coffee. I asked about tidal patterns. I smiled at beings who had laughed at me, and I gave them absolutely nothing to work with. On the 16th day, I formally requested the floor. The chamber was silent when I stood. Not the silence of boredom or dismissal. The silence of 400 species that had decided, very recently, that they wanted to hear what this particular human had to say. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. 14 years ago, I said, most of you watched us discover that we were not alone in this universe. Some of you found us interesting. Some of you found us harmless. Some of you found us amusing. I paused for just a moment. We understood all of those responses. We planned around them. I let that sit for a breath. The fleets currently in our survey territory are unharmed. Every crew member is alive. They will be returned, in full, in exchange for 3 things. A written guarantee of Sol system sovereignty, a permanent non-interference covenant, and full voting membership in this body. Another pause. We do not want war. We have never wanted war. We want a seat at a table where decisions about our future are made. You gave us 1 seat as a courtesy. We used it. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my career. It was not hostile. It was not approving. It was the sound of an enormous number of very old, very intelligent minds running calculations they had not expected to need to run. The Thres ambassador spoke first. She had kind eyes, by human standards, and she used them to look at me with something I can only describe as careful new respect. You planned this before you arrived, she said. We planned this before first contact, I told her. We have been watching this conclave for longer than you have been watching us. We learn quickly. It is perhaps our most useful quality. There was no war, there were negotiations, real ones, conducted between equals, which was all we had ever asked for. The fleets were returned intact. There was anger from the Keth, formal protests, demands for sanctions, weeks of difficult sessions. But the legal architecture held, because we had harmed no one and violated no treaty that yet existed. Humanity got its covenant, its sovereignty, its vote. People ask me sometimes whether I was afraid, sitting in that chamber alone while empires argued about whether my species deserved a future. And I tell them honestly that I was not. Not because I am particularly brave, but because the whole time, I kept thinking about something my grandfather once said. He was a chess player. He played by postcard, which tells you something about his patience. He told me once that the most dangerous piece on the board is not the most powerful one. It is the one your opponent has stopped watching. The galaxy laughed when humanity sent 1 man. That was exactly the plan.